Good morning. I am wanting to kind of talk to you a little bit about the material you're covering now. I consider this Unit 1. It's kind of the only way to help make sense. But Week 1, you're going to cover a fair amount of material coming in after the Civil War and going through that transition stage of what are we now as a country, and the struggles we go through in that way. I do want to point out, if you've not started reading yet, it would be helpful if you know that there's an introduction that kind of jumps ahead in the action, so to speak, and then it'll back up at Chapter 1 and start chronologically. So maybe that gives you an idea of what we're talking about. But in that introduction, there's several names, which let me stop and say again, if you have not looked at the study guide, I highly suggest you print it or have it on your computer screen or something like that, so as you are reading through the material, you can mark these particular terms or people or places or things so that you can know what will be on the test. Hopefully this will be helpful to you. But anyway, I'm going to kind of go through a little bit. I can't exactly replicate what we do in the classroom just because I have a distinct feeling that you guys would not listen to 5 hours of lecture, which is essentially what I probably do, probably a little bit more than that before we head into a test. But I am going to try and hit some hot spots for you. As far as the introduction goes, it tells the incredible story of some heroes you maybe know of and then some that you do not. You of course have heard of Red Cloud, especially those of you that are from Nebraska or have a little bit of understanding of Nebraska history. And Red Cloud is one of those names that's going to be on your study guide. Let me stop again and say I'm going to look down. I'm looking at my book just like you are. So just kind of keep me on track as far as what I'm doing. I hate the idea of you wondering, what is she looking at? But Red Cloud is one you're going to want to know. And essentially this is a story of government and Indian negotiations breaking down. There is this need for peace. And you know what? The truth of the matter is the Native Americans maybe haven't bought into this quite the way they should. But the reality is it's because the white man is not. Americans feel entitled to the land that the natives have owned for generations before that. And the Native Americans just don't trust the white man. And as you'll see in this particular portion, rightly so. And Red Cloud is one of the great leaders of this particular group. He is leading the negotiations. He's older, and he really does see that it's time to, let's just see what the white man has to say. Now, when I say older, he's just a few years older than me. But in this day and age, for a Native American, he's pretty old, particularly a warring type Native American. He's 44. His warlike abilities are legendary. Native Americans all know him, and his job is kind of supposed to be the voice of reason, and so he ends up participating in some negotiations, and they begin these negotiations only to figure out that the white man has double-crossed them. And so they are sent back out. The natives realize this is not working. They're frustrated. They're angry. The white man double crosses them, and so they go back out. The natives do, and they end up kind of picking a fight with each other. There is not one person or group that's responsible for this because it goes back and forth where there is a situation that the natives are I guess at fault, so to speak, as my 5- and 6-year-old would argue about whose fault it is. The next engagement is the other way around. It's retaliatory. There's no end in sight. So the next name you'd want to know from the intro is William Judd Fetterman. Fetterman is this younger officer who's in control of this portion of America, and he's got this big idea that he is going to take care of the Indian problem. Now that terminology to me is really poignant because if you think forward, those of you that are scholars or interested in World War II, you know that Hitler talked about the Jewish problem. In so many regards, there's going to be some interesting similarities if you read it deep enough. But you have Fetterman, who you do want to know for your test. He sees this Indian problem. He sees the idea that we are going to need to deal with them. And so he thinks the way to deal with them is violence, which the Indians are pretty comfortable with. No, they don't want to be at war, but this is what we know. This is what we know we can handle. And so he ends up picking a fight that he can't soon win. Essentially, this story, I do encourage you to read this material because Fetterman ends up being killed along with all of his men because he is so bound and determined to take care of this Indian problem himself, and he is wildly unprepared for Crazy Horse and his thousands of men. The Lodge Trail Ridge is still in existence today. There is a monument marking that spot where his men are killed. This Fetterman massacre is considered one of the biggest, although it is not. 80 men. I mean, let's face it, if we talk about 80 men, that sounds like a lot to us today. But in this time, in this era, 80 men's not huge. But what he does represent to me is this arrogance of the white man, of the American, that they can overcome the Indians in their own land. And they also think they can trick the Indians, which they do learn at some point that maybe that's not the right way to go. When you move into the first chapter, essentially what we're talking about is Reconstruction. Post-Civil War, America is, I mean, think about if you've got younger siblings, watching them go through adolescence and moving into teenage life, they're just confused. If you can step back far enough and realize we don't know what we are during that time period, and so really that's what we see happening in Reconstruction. Not to oversimplify things, but what this particular section talks about is that terminology, Reconstruction, which you do want to know for your test. And we see the struggle of what did we fight for, what did we accomplish, and what does that mean? And so we as Americans are just trying to figure out how to deal with that. And President Lincoln had come up with a solution. Post-war, how do we heal as a country? What does healing look like? And his idea is something called the 10% plan, which you need to know for your test. And essentially, this 10% is a promise that at least 10% of the citizens of a particular Confederate state would promise to be loyal to the Union once again. If that 10% would do that, then they could be readmitted to the Union and begin to heal, I guess is the best way to put it. Now, as you might imagine, there's a lot of Northerners who are not appreciative of this very generous plan. 10% seems really too generous in most minds. And so we see a good bit of backlash. Now, as we head into Reconstruction, there are a number of questions that are left. As I said, the question is, what did we fight for? What did we accomplish, if anything? But some other questions are, how should the country be restored? Should the South be punished further? And then who decides the course of action? How long will those steps take? What does this look like? And then what rights should be granted to the former slaves? You see, often, even now, you guys, I've told you, I think, I'm from Montgomery, Alabama. I grew up hearing these stories. And I'll be really honest with you, those of you that have had me or been around me know that I'm highly, wildly offended by those who hear, you're from Montgomery, you're white, you must be racist. That couldn't be further from the truth. And yet that's the legacy that holds on in the Deep South. Now, is that deserved? Not for me personally, but for southern states, I get it. I really do. Historically speaking, I get it. And so there's a fair amount of concern here. What rights should be granted to these states, to these slaves, excuse me, and what does that look like? Because the truth is, there's a lot of Northerners and Southerners who do not feel like that's what the war was. They don't feel like it was about blacks. They don't feel like it was about slavery. For some of them, it's just what they were supposed to do. Many, really most, there are some statistics, and I should have looked it up before I started this, and I can't remember, so my apologies. Most Southerners were not slaveholders. Certainly, I think the statistic I last heard, and I really should have looked this up, somewhere close to 90% at least did not own black slaves that participated in the war. So what are they fighting for? Well, it's just what they're supposed to do. The Northerners are the same. They don't really care. The falsity in most Americans' thinking was that all Northerners hated slavery and all Southerners loved slavery. It's not true. And we really do try to dive into that a little bit more in the seated section, but I encourage you to do a little bit of research. When we talk about what Southern life looked like at that point, what Northern life looked like at this point, it really does leave a lot to the imagination as far as what were people fighting for. With that being said, you can see that there is a fair amount of concern of what exactly do we do now that we have ended the war. So at this point, I do want to make sure that you know about that 10% plan that Lincoln had proposed. Also, on page 276, you'll notice Charles Sumner. He's a name that you want to know about. He is one that proposed the Wade-Davis bill, which you do need to know for the test as well. The Wade-Davis bill is famous primarily because of it's going against what Lincoln had proposed with the 10% plan, but it's also because of what it represents. What they're looking for is the loyalty oath by the majority of the whites in a particular southern state. Majority, 51% or more, obviously. And you know what? Here's a problem. Because if you don't do this, then you can't participate in government. And now you're just a conquered nation, essentially. And so this is a problem that they will have to deal with, and they basically duke it out in Congress. You also need to know from page 277, the Freedmen's Bureau, which was basically in charge of helping the southern states establish rights, take care of, protect the rights of the black Southerners. And there's a number of different ways that this was occurring. They were going to create schools for black children, provide medical care for those freed blacks, as well as create some opportunities for those that are still there, because what else do they know? They have no education. They have probably very limited understanding of the world beyond slavery. So what happens now to them? They're out of a job. They're out of home because if they lose their job, then they no longer have a home, right? They're living on their master's land up until this point. How do they deal with that? And so the Freedmen's Bureau is supposed to take care of that. It's the key agency for Reconstruction in establishing or assisting help for those freed men in the South. Now, with that, you see a number of different characters who are going to kind of rise up in this time period. There's a lot of concern about punishing the South. Should they be punished? How much is punishment going to look like? Lincoln did not agree with this. When he's elected for his second term, his second inaugural address had a mere 699 words. Now, you and I may not think that's all that significant, but 699 words, for those of you that have written papers in your English class, think of how many pages that is. It's not very much, but his passion comes through in his inaugural address, where he basically says that we need to restore the Union. For Lincoln, the war was not about slavery. He did not agree with it. He did not agree with the rights being abridged for the blacks there in the South. But his goal with the Civil War, which pained him so greatly, if you read any biographies about Lincoln, this man was physically sick over the war. But his goal post-Civil War into Reconstruction was to heal, was to bring the Union back together. And so essentially what he's saying in his inaugural address is we need to do what it takes to heal, period. We don't need to, he says in the book, it's quoting him, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right. Let's strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace amongst ourselves within the nations. Your book tells you that, unfortunately, just after he is elected, just after he is sworn in and he gives this beautiful short speech, he is killed by John Wilkes Booth, who you probably all have heard of before, and his vice president, Andrew Johnson, becomes the president. You need to know Booth and Johnson for your test. Now, Johnson is a contradiction in terms for sure. He is He has made so many promises. He is a poor white man who basically pulls himself up by the bootstraps. He promises that he is going to be the savior of the blacks in the South. The irony is that he accomplishes nothing in his presidency. I don't guess I should quite say it like that. But he says that he is going to be your Moses, as the book tells you. He's going to lead them through the Red Sea of war and bondage to the fairer future of liberty and peace. He could have done something incredible. Considering this is the post-war world. Unfortunately, he never did do this. The truth is, deep down, he did not believe that blacks could govern themselves or take care of themselves. About the only thing that happened in his presidency, which again is unfair, but this is a survey course and I'm trying to condense things down, of any merit is the 13th Amendment. In that, we see that he is trying to deal with what the future of America is. Do make sure you know the 13th Amendment. What we see happening during this time period is we need that kind of shift. What does the South look like? What are they supposed to do? The 13th Amendment leaves a little bit... it leaves some loopholes, and so the South takes advantage of that with something called the Black Codes. And these Black Codes really do leave Americans, or particularly the Southerners, the opportunity to do as they wish as far as dealing with the blacks that are left behind. During this time period, you also see the 14th Amendment being ratified, which states that all native-born or naturalized persons are to be considered citizens of the United States. And, you know, here's the hard part. While it does seem like language-wise this is a step in the right direction, it doesn't quite go far enough. Johnson ends up being all but a lame duck. He is full of talk, he's full of spit and venom, but he doesn't ever deliver. He doesn't go toe-to-toe with Congress in the way that he should. He's not respected. And so what we see happening as far as Reconstruction goes is they end up splitting the South into 5 quadrants or territories where they are better governed by the federal government, where we send down Union or federal or northern governors essentially to put the South out of its rebellion. Also during this time we see the Tenure of Office Act being passed. It's on page 280. And it's basically aimed right at Johnson. It's going to deny him the power to remove office holders without the approval of the Senate. Johnson's not liked, and essentially this is Congress tying his wings behind his back so that he has little influence over Reconstruction. I'm going to stop here. Hopefully this will kind of get you started, and we'll see where we go from here.